Welcome back to the Jimbo Hannon Show at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. We're talking with Adam Thierer. He is the co-author of the book, A Manifesto for Media Freedom. Let me read you something here. The truth is that there is no fairness whatever in the fairness doctrine. On the contrary, it is a chilling federal attempt to compel some undefined balance of what ideas radio and television news programs are to include. The fairness doctrine undercuts free, independent, sound, and responsive journalism, substituting government dictates. This is deceptive, dangerous, and in a democracy, repulsive, unquote. Any idea who said that, Adam?
I don't know. I like the sound of it.
A Washington Post editorial, June 24th, 1987.
How things change.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if the Post today feels the same way that it did then, but it ought to, really. Now, localism has been brought forward as a possible a backdoor, I guess, to this notion. I'll be honest with you, although certainly I'm the beneficiary of a considerable wave of syndicated national programming around the country. And, yeah, I put about 300 evening hosts out of work, a one-man unemployment boom here. But having said that, I think the idea of localism is important. I think that particularly in this era in which you're competing against a million internet sites, that one thing that sets apart a station out there in Peoria or Pensacola is that they're in Peoria or Pensacola, and to the extent that they localize, that's a good thing. But I understand that from the argument of this issue, the fairness doctrine, that may be used as a rationale, that the words fairness doctrine might not even come up in the congressional debate.
Yeah, this is a fair point, and I'm glad you brought it up, because localism in many ways is a backdoor to a sort of new, reinvigorated fairness doctrine. The problem here is that many people believe there needs to be a continuation of various types of local media outlets and reporting, and I couldn't agree more. I think that's vitally important that we have local sources of news and information. That being said, two things have to be kept in mind. First and foremost, once again, these localism rules traditionally apply only uniquely to over-the-air radio and television. You talk about Peoria. I was born in Peoria. Nobody's telling the Peoria Times what it should have in its local newspaper. But why is it that they can tell the local radio station what should be there for their local programming, how much they should air, or whatever else? Second of all, we have to ask what it is that the public really demands. And let's not forget that as we've had this explosion of media outlets and options, many people have flocked or migrated their eyes and ears over to national and even global media outlets and platforms and options. So there's been sort of an organic migration of the public's viewing habits over to these new alternatives. The people in Peoria, I can tell you, like to see what's going on nationally and internationally as much as the people in New York City do. And so how do we stop people from listening or viewing that which they want to listen or view? And that's the big problem here. Localism is partially dying its own natural death. Although, and I want to make this clear, there are still many local options. They're just being provided over different platforms now. You can probably find out just as much information in Peoria about what's happening in your local sports team, your local high school, by going online as you can by looking in your local newspaper or listening to your local radio broadcaster. So the times they've changed, and in some ways for the better, in some ways for the worse, in most ways for the better, though. We just have to understand that media has evolved and we consume it differently.
In this era of blogging, and again, this is a little off topic here, but I once had a blogger on this program, considered one of the more prominent bloggers of the day, and told him that I was proud to live in a country where you could blog up a storm, just go for it, and that the old A.J. Liebling admonition that freedom of the press belongs to the man who owns one has now been made obsolete. Everybody who can afford a personal computer can own one. Having said that, why should I pay any attention to you whatsoever? Unless you happen to be a good, snappy writer and you can make me laugh, why should I bother? I don't know anything about you, your credibility. I mean, there are some organizations out there in which I can, based on a previous track record, judge their credibility. I can't judge your credibility at the Joe Blow blog.
It's a fair point, and I understand what you're saying. As I said before, many people can now speak, but not everyone's going to be listening. And the fact of the matter is, in a very crowded blogosphere, it's tough to elbow your way to the top. In fact, there are only a handful of bloggers that command very overwhelming audiences, and a lot of bloggers like myself aggregate their activities with many other bloggers on a themed site that that directs his attention to a very narrow or niche audience. That's the only way we can sort of carve out any sort of audience in this crowded media sphere. But that being said, overall, aren't we in a better place than we were 20, 30 years ago? I still think that mass media, that traditional over-the-air terrestrial broadcasting, radio, television, local newspapers, and so on, they still have an important place in our new media marketplace. That being said, there's no turning back the clock. There's no way they will ever command the sort of market share or attention share that they had, pre-1980. That's just not going to happen. We live in a fractured, fragmented media world now, but that's actually all the reason more not to have government and the FCC bureaucrats regulating the oldest traditional broadcasters and radio providers, because they're struggling most to survive, and we need them to survive to get certain types of basic information out on a mass market basis.
Of course, if you have now giant corporations owning hundreds and hundreds of radio stations, and they work about paying off huge bank loans because they grew far faster than they had any reasonable reason to do so, then you find them cutting even the most basic of services. Case in point, there was a situation that happened not that far from metropolitan Washington, D.C. some years back, but far enough away that probably listening to Washington media, at least on the radio, was not the first choice. And there was a tornado that hit this particular community, hit it hard. And the local radio station, owned by one of the big conglomerates, blathered on the entire time. It was a weekend. Blathered together the entire time all about fair to partly cloudy by an announcer's recorded voice. It was recorded on Friday afternoon, and he'd be back in first thing Monday morning to change it. Now, there are certain aspects of localism that we need to bring back. I'll put it this way, if in a licensed circumstance that is your way of serving your community, you have no business having that license. That should have been yanked from that company on the spot.
Well, listen, the problem with that is that if you're going to have the FCC be empowered to yank licenses the first time there's a screw-up like that...
That wasn't a screw-up, that was planned that way. Well, it wasn't like the guy didn't show up. I mean, if there had been 100 tornadoes on 100 consecutive weekends, you would still have had fair to partly cloudy.
I understand. And I'm not here to defend any local radio stations' actions in that regard, but the fact of the matter is that that's not the way the vast majority of radio operators and television operators run their businesses, because they can't. The public is obviously not going to tolerate that sort of behavior. And the argument that, somehow there's going to be some bad actors out there, and therefore that justifies the FCC yanking licenses, well, hey, that's only one step removed from the FCC saying, and you should also have a fair and balanced set of viewpoints on every issue you cover on your radio or television station.
Providing information that can save lives, I think, is not a slippery slope to the notion of what you put on in terms of opinion content. I would just simply note in response to that, and again, not directly pertaining to the topic, but this is one where you can cover a lot of bases here. I would bet you that of the 13,000 radio stations in this country, well in excess of 6,500, well in excess, are totally unmanned from Friday afternoon until Monday morning.
Yeah, I think a lot of them probably are, because radio as a medium has evolved, and it's not the same sort of medium it was, say, 20 or 30 years ago. Well, it simply can't support, economically, this is the grim reality of it, Jim, and I think you know this because you work in this business. The radio industry is struggling for its life. And we know that it'll never be the same sort of force that it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. I hate to think that, because I was raised on radio in the fields of Illinois and Indiana. But the reality is, in these sorts of economic situations with all this media competition, they're going to have to take some steps to survive. Some of that will include cutting some services that we don't like to see cut. Now, does that mean the FCC should come in and yank their license? I mean, that's a tough question.
Maybe they should just be required to broadcast a disclaimer.
And what if
from 5 o'clock this afternoon until 9 a.m. Monday morning, don't expect us to tell you if a tornado is going to come into town, because we ain't going to know.
That's a fair point, and I could probably live with that. I have a harder time living with the fact that you're going to have some sort of FCC oversight of every single thing that a local radio station does. And now there's talk, this localism regulation that we were talking about, there's talk of having the idea of community oversight boards boards that somehow have some sort of a say over the local radio station. Again, sounds
Who goes on those boards?
Well, that's a great question. I have a feeling that some of the people on those boards will probably be out-and-out sort of media bashers who will want to get all sorts of kooky things on the radio, and not the things that you and I are talking about here.
Well, we used to have something similar to that in the old days before the Communications Act of '96, when the Communications Act of '34 was in power, and you had to ascertain community needs, which essentially meant that every 3 years or however long your license was, you had to go and talk to the head of the Ministerial Alliance and the head of the Kiwanis and the Rotary Clubs and the mayor and the city council, and to decide if in fact you were giving enough time to the public service ghetto on Sunday morning, in which you had dry discussions about dry topics that no one listened to. That was what you had before. Now, what this would entail, well, when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about that community involvement, which, again, like the term fairness doctrine, sounds really good. The devil is in the details, and we'll get more of those from the co-author of a Manifesto for Media Freedom, which is published by Encounter Books. Our guest, Adam Theurer, will be right back. Welcome back to the Jimbo Hannon Show. We're talking with Adam Theurer. He is Senior Fellow at the Progress and Freedom Foundation, co-author of a Manifesto for Media Freedom, published by Encounter Books. Let's talk to Stuart in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Hello, Stuart. Oh, Stuart, are you there? Well, possibly we'll get back to Stuart here in a minute. All right. Talking more with Mr. Theurer here now about a variety of issues related to the fairness doctrine per se. What were we talking about before the break?
The localism requirement.
The localism requirement. We were still on localism, yes. Okay. Is there any way to nudge broadcasters in the direction of doing more of that without getting heavy-handed?
Well, I think there is when the community itself nudges the broadcaster to do more of it.
The community aspect, these community boards.
But the idea of a mandatory community board that somehow the FCC gives its blessing to serve as a sort of quasi-regulatory or oversight body, it spooks me a little bit, because, quite frankly, I'm not sure exactly what they'll be empowered to do or what exactly they will allow to say on the radio, that they be required to have airtime or something, because that's when it starts to sound a heck of a lot like the fairness doctrine. Moreover, I get back to this question of the fundamental fairness of these rules. I mean, these are, again, not things that apply to your local newspaper or to any local cable television station operator, any cable channel or satellite operator, or anybody online. And so the question is, we continue to unfairly single out one class of media providers, broadcasters, based on the archaic regulatory rationales and distinctions of the 1930s. Just doesn't make sense.
Yeah. It does make no sense whatsoever, I would agree, and it is nothing more than just something that is archaic. Things didn't keep up with modern technology. We have, I believe, Stuart in Pittsfield, Massachusetts now?
Hello?
Yes, go right ahead. You're on the radio.
Oh, okay. I really love your show. I've only listened to it like 4 times. You have some great topics.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I want to first say that. I'll ask 2 quick questions, and then I'll hang up and listen to the answer. The first one is I think Americans are just starved for the truth, and I'm wondering if you think that the timing of this is a little funny with the fact that mainstream media's ratings are plummeting and people are, published, like newspapers are, dying out. And if you could speak to that. And also, do you think this transcends liberal and Republican? Because I believe the same liberals that were screaming about all this, data mining that the government's doing, I think they're going to just use that to regulate it. You guys were talking about that earlier, and if you could just speak to those 2 questions. Thank you.
Well, the first question about public being starved for the truth and the nature of the modern media marketplace, I think, first of all, again, getting back to our main theme of tonight's discussion, there are more places to find truth and find information than ever before. Sorting through those options is a difficult task, but the reality is that you have more ways to find more viewpoints to determine what you think is the truth than ever before. Is it true that mass media is having a harder time steering the news or determining what is is truth, yes, that is definitely true. I mean, the CBS Newses of the world and the New York Times of the world, they're not going to be the thought dictators or leaders that they once were. That's not going to be the world we're going to live in going forward. There's going to be a lot more competition out there. And the second question I'm a little bit more confused about data mining, so I have to take a pass on that one.
Yeah, I must confess I didn't quite follow that either, although in the notion that this is a purely liberal versus conservative argument, that if in fact you're liberal, this is a wonderful idea, and if you're conservative, this is a terrible idea. Well, there are aspects of that here in a liberal predisposition to say when in doubt regulate, and a conservative predisposition when in doubt don't regulate. But it goes beyond that. Quite frankly, if you're a Pacifica radio station out there, do you really want Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity forced on your airwaves? Mm-hmm. I mean, I think liberals ought to think a little bit about the fact that this is a double-edged sword.
I think that's a great point, Jim, and I think it's something that many of them haven't thought of, although I think a lot of them would take that deal if they thought they could somehow get their own people on maybe Rush or Sean's show or any other out there. But again, it gets back to this question about exactly what constitutes right, left, or one side of a view or an issue or another. It's never that binary or easy, and why should unelected bureaucrats at the FCC be sitting there with stopwatches trying to determine, is that enough time to be dedicating to this issue or that issue or this opinion or that one? That's not doable anymore, in my opinion.
No, I agree with you, and I'm not one who is congenitally opposed to anything regulatory. But in this particular case, if you really look at exactly what would happen or supposedly happen, you just wind up essentially with largely a rewrite of that Washington Post editorial, which is deceptive, dangerous, and repulsive in a democracy. So I don't have any real problem with that. I think that's simply where we are, and we've got to face up to the reality of it. 1-866-50-JIMBO is our number. 1-866-505-4626 on the Jimbo Hannon Show with Adam Thierer. He is, again, the co-author of a manifesto for media freedom. We're going to come back and talk some more about this Encounter Books publication when we return here at Westwood One. Welcome back to the Jimbo Hannon Show. As we talk tonight with Adam Thierer, co-author of a manifesto for media freedom, published by Encounter Books. Back when the Fairness Doctrine first went into effect, there were a lot of radio stations that carried some early shows like Joe Pine and the like, talk shows of controversy. It simply said, this isn't worth the hassle. We'll just go back to spinning Percy Faith and Madhavani records. Today, if anybody out there thinks that seriously a reimposition of the Fairness Doctrine in one form or another would destroy Rush and Sean and all the rest of the voices of talk radio, no, they would destroy the tower and transmitter industry and people dependent on that, but the shows would simply go to the internet, where it would be virtually impossible to regulate it.
You've got it exactly right, Jim. In fact, your own show's a good example of how you can essentially multi-purpose media in many different ways on many different platforms today. I know you have a podcast for your show, as do many other radio broadcasters. Your information is all over the internet. There are many ways to get the word and the message out, and so they would find an alternative platform. But wouldn't that be a shame if that's what would happen, if that regulation had that same sort of chilling effect that it once did? And that's why we got the Fairness Doctrine off the books, and why we've tried to avoid it for the last 20 years, is because we don't want to see that sort of chilling effect on vibrant debate out there in America. Certainly, the principle of the matter is sound. Let's encourage more diverse viewpoints to be aired and debated. That's a great principle. Same with localism. Let's encourage more local programming. But let's not have it mandated from the top down. That's not the American way to do this.
Mm-hmm. Your own thoughts on just betting odds here. You've got a very Democratic Congress, a Democratic president, albeit one who has said that he is not in favor of the Fairness Doctrine, but I'll have to say very honestly that his pronouncements against it have been a lot more tepid than some of the announcements on Capitol Hill in favor of it. I'm just wondering if he's willing to go to the mat against his own party and veto such a bill.
Agreed, and I think it would be foolish for the left to mount a